And today we have 4 talks. Because of that, I suggest that we have a break, like a 10-minute, 15-minute break after the second talk. So we are going to have a first talk by Swami Medhananda. He's going to speak about God in Ramakrishna, harmonizing the personal God with the impersonal Brahman, situating Sri Ramakrishna vis-à-vis Vaiṣṇava Vedanta traditions. Then after, we are going to have a talk by Suganya. He's going to speak about the concept of God in the Alvar. And after the break, we are going to have a joint talk by Srinivas Varakendi and Srinivas Kumar. They are going to talk about the concept of God in Madhva. And the last talk will be by Kenneth Valpik. He's going to speak about the concept of God in Swami Prabhupada. So before introducing our first talk, I'm going to very, very quickly speak some few words about our project. So this workshop is part of a philosophical approach to the Vaiṣṇava concept of God, a project funded by the John Templeton Foundation through the Global Philosophy of Religion project, which is hosted by the University of Birmingham. The project is hosted by the Brazilian Association for the Philosophy of Religion in collaboration with the Logic and Religion Association. And the workshop additionally is supported by the Oxford Center for Hindu Studies and the Institute for Vaiṣṇava Studies. So let me introduce our first speaker. So Swami Medhananda is a monk on the Ramakrishna order and associate professor and head of the program in philosophy at Ramakrishna Mission Vivekananda Educational and Research Institute in West Bengal, India. His current research focuses on Vedantic philosophical traditions, cross-cultural philosophy of religion, cross-cultural approaches to consciousness, Indian scriptural hermeneutics, and the philosophies of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo. He's the author of 2 books, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion, published by Oxford University Press in 2018, and The Dialectics of Aesthetic Agency, Re-Evaluating German Aesthetics from Kant to Adorno, published by Bloomsbury in 2013. He's also the editor of the Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Vedanta, published in 2020, a volume of 16 newly commissioned chapters by a team of the international scholars. He has been invited to lecture at Princeton University, Graduate Theological Union, California, Presidency University in Kolkata, and the Indian Institute of Advanced Studies, among other institutions. He received his PhD in 2009 from the University of California at Berkeley, where he specialized in German philosophy. And the title, I already said, but I'm going to say it again. The title of his talk is Harmonizing the Personal God with the Impersonal Brahman, situating Sri Ramakrishna vis-à-vis Vaiṣṇava Vedantic traditions. So the idea is that he will speak for about 25-30 minutes, and then we are going to have time for discussion. So Swami Medhananda, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ricardo, and thank you all for attending. Can you all see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Great. So most of you are aware that Sri Ramakrishna was a 19th century Bengali mystic. And he was raised in a Vaiṣṇava household. His household deity was Raghuvid, form of Ramachandra. And later in his life, when he practiced different sadhanas, different spiritual practices, he performed a number of Vaiṣṇava practices. And fairly high-level practices, where one of them is where he identified with the bhava of Radha, the divine consort of Krishna. And he also, at one point in his sadhana, he also adopted this Hanuman sadhana. He behaved like Hanuman. And through these different practices, he claimed to have attained realizations of different forms and aspects of one and the same God. So he claimed to have realized Krishna, Rama, Sita, Hanuman. And then the question comes, should we consider Ramakrishna to be a Vaishnava, a practicing Vaishnava, or something else? And there's a bit of scholarly controversy about this. Exactly how do we situate Ramakrishna? Was he a card-carrying Vaishnavite? And Narasimha Sil, for instance, the scholar Narasimha Sil, he makes the argument that he's basically a Vaishnavite in orientation. Ramakrishna was a Vaishnavite. And I, in my work, especially in the book that Ricardo mentioned, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, I push against that. And I argue that Ramakrishna's spiritual philosophy is broader than the Vaishnava philosophy in certain respects and different from it in other respects. And so I want to talk about that a little bit today. What are the similarities and what are the differences between Ramakrishna's philosophy and the philosophy of Vaishnavism? So another thing that's important to keep in mind before we read this first slide, one thing that's distinctive about Ramakrishna as a mystic is that he practiced numerous different religious traditions. So apart from Vaishnava sadhanas, he also practiced Advaita Vedanta under an Advaitin guru named Totapuri, a wandering monk that came to visit him in Dakshineshwar. But he also practiced Shakta Tantra, and his Ishta Devata, his chosen deity, was Kali. And he was a priest in Kali temple. He also practiced, interestingly, both Christianity and Islam at different points in his spiritual life. So he had this very, very broad outlook on religious and spiritual life. And after all of his spiritual practices and realizations, he came to this conclusion. He says, it is not good to feel that one's own religion alone is true and all others are false. God is one only and not two. Different people call on him by different names, some as Allah, some as God, and others as Krishna, Shiva, and Brahman. It is like the water in a lake. Some drink it at one place and call it jal, others at another place and call it pani, and still others at a third place and call it water. The Hindus call it jal, the Christians water, and the Muslims pani, but it is one and the same thing. Spiritual views are but paths. Each religion is only a path leading to God, as rivers come from different directions and ultimately become one in the one ocean. So the highlighted statement here, I hope clarifies Ramakrishna's, or what I see as the response to the first question in the project that you asked us to focus on a few of the questions. So the first question is, can we think of the tradition that you're discussing as a monotheistic one? And I think it's pretty clear that Ramakrishna wasn't a monotheist. He was certainly not a polytheist. He believed that God was one. At the same time, I think his view is broader than monotheism, because monotheism is, depending on how you interpret it, it could mean that you take God only to be personal, theistic. But Ramakrishna's view is actually broader than that, as far as I understand it, because he accepts also the impersonal dimension of God. And as I'm going to argue in the course of this presentation, he gives both equal ontological reality and equal value to both the personal and impersonal dimensions of the ultimate reality. Now, another really distinctive kind of spiritual experience he had is one that he called Vijnana. And it's important to understand this. To understand his views on God, we have to understand his description of this special spiritual experience of Vijnana. So this is what he says. He says, the Jnani, the knower of Brahman, gives up his identification with worldly things, discriminating not this, not this. Only then can he realize Brahman. It is like reaching the roof of a house by leaving the steps behind one by one. But the Vijnani, who is more intimately acquainted with Brahman, realizes something more. He realizes that the steps are made of the same materials as the roof, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That which is realized as Brahman through the eliminating process of not this, meaning neti, neti, is then found to have become the universe and all its living beings. The Vijnani sees that the reality which is nirguna, impersonal and without attributes, is also saguna, personal and with attributes. A man cannot live on the roof for a long time. He comes down again. Those who realize Brahman in samadhi, by which he means nirvikalpa samadhi, come down also and find that it is Brahman that has become the universe and its living beings. This is known as Vijnana. So this is a very important passage. He says it many, many times in his teachings. And if we were to put it in the form of a slogan, he claims that there are two stages in spiritual experience, two ultimate stages in spiritual experience. The first is what he calls jnana. And he claims that the Advaita Jnani realizes that this is the famous formula from one of the works attributed to Shankara, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. And here Brahman should be understood as Nirguna Brahman, the impersonal attributeless Brahman. So Brahman alone, Nirguna Brahman alone is real, and this entire universe is an illusion, it's unreal. It's like a dream. That's the Jnani standpoint. But what Ramakrishna claims is that after attaining the state of jnana, after attaining nirvikalpa samadhi and realizing your oneness with non-dual Brahman, there's certain divinely commissioned souls that can come back down to the relative plane after the state of nirvikalpa, after attaining the state of nirvikalpa samadhi, and they have a very different kind of realization. And in the form of another slogan, this is my own language. This is not, but it's just a way of encapsulating what I think Ramakrishna means. The Vijnani realizes Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam. So there are two key differences, right? First of all, that not only Nirguna Brahman, but Shakti, Saguna Brahman, the personal God, is equally real as Nirguna Brahman. And Jagat is not Mithya, Jagat is Satyam. This world is also real. How is it real? It's real as a manifestation of Shakti. So let's keep this spiritual experience of Vijnana in the background. So on the basis of his spiritual experiences, he made a number of very important claims and original claims about the nature of God. So I'm just mentioning 4 of them. So he says, number 1, I have realized that Brahman and Shakti are inseparable. The Bengali here is abhed, like water and its wetness, like fire and its power to burn. So by Brahman, he means here Nirguna Brahman, the Advaitic non-dual absolute, which is impersonal. And by Shakti, he always means the personal God. That's even more clear from the second teaching. When God is actionless or inactive, Nishkriya, I call God Brahman. When God creates, preserves, and destroys, I call God Shakti. And notice here in the second teaching that he's not implying any kind of hierarchy. It's really about how you look at God, or what state you perceive God in, whether the state is an inactive state or whether it's an active or dynamic state. So he's not privileging one over the other, the personal or the impersonal aspect. Third, the divine reality who is called Brahman by the Jnanis, so here he has in mind the Advaita Jnanis, is known as Atman by the yogis and as Bhagavan by the bhaktas. A bit later in my presentation, I'm going to point out that this seems to be a direct allusion to a famous verse from the Bhagavata Purana. I'll get to that. And fourth, he says, this is something he says frequently, bhaktas, devotees of God, of the personal God, they don't want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar. And this is important too. We should keep in mind that for Ramakrishna, whether you want to dwell in a higher loka as your ultimate goal and dwell in loving communion with the personal God, or whether you have more of an Advaitic or Buddhistic leaning and you want to just dissolve your individuality in non-dual Brahman, he says either is fine and both are equally valuable. It's just a matter of preference, in the same way that some people, want to eat sugar and other people want to become sugar. It's not that one is higher than the other. And he makes this explicit in a dialogue with one of his householder devotees, whose name was Mohima Chakraborty, who is an Advaita Vedantan. He favored the impersonal conception of the absolute. And so he asked Ramakrishna this question. He said, I have a question to ask, sir. A bhakta needs Advaitic nirvana sometime or other, doesn't he? So Mohima was under the impression that because he was an Advaitan, he felt that, okay, I can accept bhakti on some lower level. It's an inferior practice, but ultimately everybody has to reach the Advaitic realization. This would seem to be his perspective. But Ramakrishna says no in response. He says, it cannot be said that bhaktas need nirvana. There is a state in which the eternal Krishna is with his eternal bhaktas. The original Bangla here is Nitto Krishna Tar Nitto Bhakto. Krishna is spirit embodied and his abode is spirit embodied. Chinmoy Sham, Chinmoy Dham. Krishna is eternal and the bhaktas also are eternal. Nitto Krishna, Nitto Bhakto. So I think it's very clear here that he does not claim that the ultimate goal for all spiritual aspirants is Advaitic realization. He says it's a matter of preference. And for bhaktas, the goal might very well be living in a higher loka like Vraja loka with the personal God in a loving relationship. Now, with this in the background, I wanted to begin to situate Ramakrishna vis-a-vis traditional Vedantic schools. And it's going to require a little bit of Vedanta 101 here, but just bear with me because it won't be very long. So according to the Vaiṣṇava theologians Ramanuja, the Vishtadvaita Ramanuja, and the Dvaita Vedanta and Madhva, Brahman is exclusively the personal God, Saguna Brahman, which they refer to as Vishnu Narayana, endowed with all of the omni attributes, so omniscience, omnipotence, and so on, all loving. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, the Advaita Vedanta and Shankara and his followers, they conceive Brahman in exactly the opposite manner, as strictly impersonal, nirguna, and non-dual pure consciousness. They admit the provisional reality of the personal God, which means Shankara admits that the personal God, this world, and individual souls are real, but only from the Vyavaharika standpoint, from the relative standpoint. But the moment you attain knowledge of non-dual Brahman, you realize that the only reality, the sole reality, is Nirguna Brahman. So the personal God is ultimately non-existent for Shankara. So now, within the Vedantic tradition, there's one school, but there are multiple schools that hold this view. So there are two schools, as far as I'm aware, that hold a different view from either Shankara on the one hand or Madhva and Ramanuja on the other. One of them is Achintya Bheda Veda Vedanta, Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And the other school is Vallabha Shuddhadvaita. I'm not talking about Vallabha today, but I believe somebody else, Frederick Smith, is going to talk about Vallabha. So we'll let him talk about Vallabha. But I wanted to mention briefly Gaudiya Vaishnavism. So Gaudiya Vaishnava theologians in the tradition of Chaitanya reconciled to a certain extent these conflicting views on ultimate reality. These conflicting views means the views of Shankara on the one hand and the views of Ramanuja and Madhva on the other. So how did they reconcile these views? They reconciled them by holding that the supreme reality is the personal God Krishna, whose peripheral effulgence, the Sanskrit word here is either Prabha or Tanubha, is the impersonal Brahman. I think the term Prabha or Tanubha can be translated in many ways. This is just one suggestion taken from Swami Tapasen on the peripheral effulgence. But it should be very clear that the impersonal Brahman is a subordinate aspect of the personal God Krishna, according to Gaudiya Vaishnavism. And Vishwanatha Chakravartin is one of the prominent Gaudiya Vaishnava theologians, and this is what he says. He says, the bliss of Krishna's love in Gokula far exceeds the paltry, loveless happiness in Brahman. Prema rahitat Brahma sukha anubhavat prema sahito Vaikuntha sukha anubhavaha shrestha. So there's clearly a normative valence here, right? I mean, clearly he's saying that the bliss of loving Krishna in Gokula is far superior to the joy involved in realizing Advaitic Brahman. And he makes this even clearer in his commentary on Bhagavata Purana 1.2.11. It's a famous verse. This is the verse. That which the knowers of reality say is reality is non-dual knowledge. It is called Brahman, Paramatma, and Bhagavan. Vadanti tat tattva vidas tattvam yajnanam advayam brahmeti paramatmeti bhagavaniti shabdyate. So according to Vishwanatha, in his commentary, he says that so he basically interprets this verse in a hierarchical manner. And he says that bhaktas alone have the capacity to grasp that Bhagavan is the one who has unlimited qualities like form, beauty, playfulness, and an essence, swarupa, that is incomprehensibly infinite, and composed of consciousness and bliss. Achintya ananta chid anandamaya swarupa rupa guna liladi aneka dharma vatva atya grahana yogyatayam. And by contrast, he distinguishes three levels of adhikari, of qualified spiritual aspirants. And he says the lowest level, the inferior aspirants, are the Gyanis. So he just flips the tables on Shankara. And he says that the Gyanis, in fact, are lower on this hierarchy than the Bhaktas. And he says that these Advaita Gyanis experience the divine reality, which they call Brahman, as quote, formless and devoid of the distinction between knower, the known, etc. And they only realize the divine as consciousness in general, Chit Samanyam. The second rung of spiritual aspirants, according to Vishwanatha, are the yogis. And he says that the yogis are superior to the Gyanis, but and the reason they're superior is because they experience two or three qualities, dharmas, of the divine reality, which these yogis call Paramatma. One quality, for instance, is the quality of being the inner controller of all beings, Antaryami in Sanskrit. But as I mentioned, Vishwanatha places bhaktas above both the yogis and the jnanis. He says that the bhaktas alone realize Bhagavan in his fullness. So keep that hierarchy in mind, because remember, I want to remind you again of one of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. Remember, this is the teaching. The divine reality who is called Brahman by the jnanis is known as Atman by the yogis and as Bhagavan by the bhaktas. And Ramakrishna was quite familiar with the Bhagavata Purana. There were a number of pundits who would read out loud from the Bhagavata. And so I think it's very likely that he was aware of 1.2.11. And even notice that the language used is very similar to the verse. So I think it's useful to compare Vishwanatha's Gaudiya Vaishnava interpretation of Bhagavata 1.2.11 and Ramakrishna's. So according to Vishwanatha, the Gaudiya Vaishnava tradition, this verse implies a hierarchy where Brahman realized by jnanis and the Atman realized by yogis are, even though they're all real, they're inferior. Those realizations are inferior to the realization of Bhagavan by bhaktas. And according to Ramakrishna, there's no hierarchy whatsoever. He says that, you can realize God however you want, and there's no higher and lower. They're both equal. They're all equally valuable. So Ramakrishna maintains that the impersonal Brahman Atman and the personal Shakti are complementary aspects of one and the same infinite reality. And accordingly, he holds that jnanis, yogis, and bhaktas all realize one and the same infinite reality in different aspects and forms, none of which can be said to be superior to any of the others. So now, just to sum up, and I guess we'll have a little bit more time for questions. I prepared more like a 20-minute presentation. So if we were to try to situate Ramakrishna in what I'm calling a Vedantic dialectic about God, it might look like this. So on the one hand, Shankara grants ontological reality only to Nirguna Brahman, the impersonal non-dual Brahman. On the other hand, Ramanuja and Madhva grant ontological reality only to Saguna Brahman, Vishnu Narayana, the personal God. Gaudiya Vaishnava theologians, Achintya Bheda Bheda Vadans, they grant equal ontological reality to both the personal God Krishna and the impersonal non-dual Brahman. So I see them as making an advance in the, whatever. If I don't mean it normatively, but I just mean it, if you think about it as a dialectic, they're in a sense harmonizing or beginning to harmonize the views of Shankara on the one hand and Ramanuja and Madhva on the other by granting equal ontological reality to both the personal and the impersonal dimensions of God. At the same time, however, these Gaudiya Vaishnava theologians hold that realization of the personal God Krishna is far superior to Advaitic realization and to the realization of yogis. And this is where I see Ramakrishna advancing even further in the dialectics. So Ramakrishna, by contrast, grants both equal ontological reality and equal value to the personal God Krishna and the impersonal non-dual Brahman. So I'll just leave it on that note, and I'd like to hear from you now. Thanks.
All right, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the interesting presentation. So now we have quite a time for questions. So anyone who wants, okay, so we have a question. Kenneth Valpi, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Swami Medhananda. Nice to see you again.
Yes,
I don't know if you remember. We met.
Of course I do. Yes, yes. You came to visit me at Bilumat. Yeah.
This is kind of a parenthetical thing to all that you're discussing, but it raised a curiosity in me that because you said it a few times that Sri Ramakrishna saw it simply as a matter of preference, whether one pursues one or another of the types of realization. I wonder whether he theologized at all about that preference? Why would it be that one person has this preference and another has the preference for Advaita Brahman realization, and another would have preference for Saguna, for Bhagavan realization?
That's a great question. And in fact, he does in several places. And one of the ways he puts it is this. He says, there are two types of people. And he says, one type of soul is born as an amsha of Vishnu. He says, Vishnu Rangsha Janma in Bangla. And there is another type of person who's born as an amsha of Shiva, Shiva Rangsha Janma. And he says that those who are born as an amsha of Vishnu are the ones who just temperamentally are inclined toward bhakti. And those who are born as an amsha, as a portion of Shiva, they tend to incline toward Advaita Vedanta or the more impersonal kind of philosophies. So that's a short answer to your question.
Well, then that, of course, begs the question, how did he consider himself in terms of, did he see himself as an amsha of anyone, considering that he saw them all equal?
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, I think, this is something I didn't mention, but on his deathbed, he told Vivekananda, his chief disciple who went on to become a monk, he told him, he who was Rama and Krishna is now Ramakrishna in this body. So he considered himself an avatara, and he said it on many occasions. And as I mentioned, he had very kind of diverse spiritual practices and realizations. So it would be difficult to place an avatara within those two categories. And I wonder whether it wouldn't even be appropriate. I'm not sure. I mean, if anything, if I were forced to choose, I would say he falls on the side of the bhaktas. But I would prefer to say that because he claimed that he himself was an avatara, they may not fall so neatly into one of those two categories.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Now, Pujarini, please.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
My question is that when someone is merged with the absolute Brahman, because that means like when we realize the reality between the personal God and the absolute Brahman, then do you think that we should continue to hold the personal Brahman, because the main goal of the human life or the human soul is to get the realization of the highest truth, and that truth is the absolute Brahman. So what the use of the personal God after the realization of the reality? Thank you.
Right. Thank you, Pujarini. So yeah, everything depends on your belief system, right? And so you're asking the question from the standpoint of Advaita Vedanta. And so of course, for Advaita Vedantans, the highest goal is to realize your identity with non-dual Brahman. But others don't agree, right? So that's it would be begging the question to ask. But Ramakrishna, he doesn't hold that view. He holds that the bhakta's goal of dwelling in an eternal loving communion with the personal God is as valuable as the Advaitic realization of one's identity with non-dual Brahman. So you don't have to agree with that, but I'm trying to explain Ramakrishna's perspective. Did that answer your question?
Yes, just a clarification, like if you look the reality about the masculine and feminine energy, because you have already highlighted about the Shakti. So if that Shakti is already inside us, because both the energy or the polarities is within us. So once we merge with the both masculine and feminine energy, why do we need such kind of such kind of distinction between the personal God and Brahman? Because that is I think the conceptual understanding just to go through that spiritual process.
Okay, I mean, I'm not entirely sure I understand what you mean by masculine and feminine energies, because what I'm trying to do in this lecture is to try to be internal to Ramakrishna's own language, and he understood God in two aspects, the personal and the impersonal aspects, and he claimed to have realized both aspects of God. So he believed that they were both real, And I think one thing you were raising is that there might be a difference between the way that we philosophize about the nature of God and the way that we realize God, which I think is certainly true. But even after Ramakrishna's realizations, he still found it useful to use these categories. In Bangla, the terms are nirguna and saguna, right? I mean, it's taken from the Sanskrit. So if we stay internal to his way of thinking, I think that it's still useful to think about these categories.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, good. Now, please, Alan, ask your question.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very nice. A couple, just first of all, just to clarify something, actually to follow on from Kenneth's question, that I'm trying to understand. So we're talking about, this is brief before, are we talking about preference here, or is there an adhikar involved in this? Is there somehow or other something determined within the person, whether the person becomes attracted to Shiva or whether it's Vishnu? Is it something that's ontological within the person, or is there some kind of preference there? That's just to clarify.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I guess I wonder whether the two things are not necessarily, I mean, I don't know how easy it is to separate the two things. Just like, it might be that I prefer one thing precisely because I'm sort of ontologically, I have a kind of adhikaritva for that. I mean, I think that there's some people, like, you know, one person might prefer basketball to tennis, but part of the reason is because he's genetically better at playing basketball, for instance.
Yeah.
So I wonder whether, I mean, I don't think it's necessarily an either or. I think it could be both, involve both.
Right. So a lot of this was to do with perception, isn't it? I mean, to a degree, how an individual perceives. It's kind of almost like a subjective way of understanding, or a concept of God that is based on a kind of subjectivity.
Well, yeah, that's interesting. But again, this is something I discuss in detail in chapter 5 of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, but I'll say it briefly here. But there's a very important objective dimension, which is this, that he says again and again that God, because God is bhakta vatsal, this again is a Vaiṣṇava term, of course. It's God loves us, he's a lover of his devotees. As bhakta vatsal, God manifests two different spiritual aspirants to different devotees in the form they love most. So you see, that's the objective side, which is that if I'm a Christian and I prefer to think of God as Christ, God will manifest to me by his grace and through, if I do enough spiritual practices, in the form of Christ. Whereas for a Vaiṣṇava, that same God will manifest to Vaishnavas as Krishna, precisely because we love to think of God as Krishna, right? You see, that's more of a, so it kind of combines the subjective and objective in a way. It's not purely subjective.
Okay, this is something I'm dealing with as well. I've got to also present tomorrow as well, because I'm dealing with the Gaudias. But this idea of, okay, so it was an interesting definition of Shakti that you had, which was almost like, okay, so you said that, I think, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're talking about Brahman, and then we're talking about Shakti, and Shakti being, Brahman being Nirguna, and Shakti being the Saguna, almost like, is that correct? Right, and so within going to the Gaudiya side of it, Shakti has a very specific meaning in that it's it's almost in the sense of we use in this kind of project as almost like an attribute type of thing. It's a potency, energy, whatever you want to call it, right? And then we have issues of essence, like the Shakti Mat, and the issue of the Shakti, that which comes from, so then we have issues, as I've been trying to like get my head around, of like in the Western traditions, they do a lot with this idea of attributes being something that is of the essence, that kind of distinguishes an essence in a certain way, right? Whereas in the Indian system, there's especially in the Gaudiya, there's a difference and a non-difference involved in that as well. So just trying to get my head around this, the way you expressed it was almost like, I mean, the first thing that came into my head was this, almost everyone has, is this quantum, like what is it, the particle wave thing, if you observe this particle, whatever, it becomes a particle. If you don't observe it, it acts like a wave type of thing. So you have both within one. Is that the kind of direction this is heading in with a concept of God for Ramakrishna and maybe the tradition?
Yeah, I mean, there are different analogies. I mean, of course, he didn't use analogies from physics, but he did use the example of an ocean. And he says, when water is still, that corresponds to Nirguna Brahman. When it's in waves, when it's in motion, It's the same water, but he that corresponds to Shakti, to the dynamic dynamic personal God, basically. So it depends. Yeah, I mean, the wave particle thing could be useful. I mean, I don't know how far we want to push it, but the idea is that God has infinite forms and aspects, and as a result, we also can think of God in the way that we prefer, based on whatever, as you know, there could be an ontological dimension to it, but also, you know, just our preference. And yeah, I mean, maybe another example would be like, you know, if my father is a policeman and he's also my father and he's also a husband, right? But like, if I like to think of him in one way, like I'll prefer, I don't like to see him in his police uniform, you know? So that might be a stupid example. But the point, yeah, there's definitely a preference dimension, but there's also, as I said, what I call in my book, manifestationism, that God loves to manifest to devotees in the form that they love most.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you mind me, one very, very last quick thing, just to if I can clarify it. So you have Ramakrishna himself, then you have the followers of Ramakrishna, right? And would you classify them as potentially Vaishnavas or following in his footsteps, as not more broader than Vaishnavism? Is there a lay kind of like, you know, practitioner, and there's a scholarly practitioner, maybe a differentiator between those two? Just an idea of the tradition itself.
Yeah, but I didn't get the first part of your question about the Vaishnavas. What do you say?
The practitioners, like we have Ramakrishna, and you expressed him being kind of a little broader than Vaishnavism, right? Maybe there's similarities, but not. The practitioners within the Ramakrishna mission, would they be similar to him? Was there a differentiation between the lay practitioners? Do they have different concepts of God? That's what I'm trying to get at.
Right. Oh, I see. Okay, yeah, I get it. In fact, in our tradition, both monastic and lay, there have been different interpretations of Ramakrishna's teachings, and the view I'm pushing is not accepted by all the other followers of Ramakrishna. Some people interpret Ramakrishna as a Shankarite, as an Advaita Vedanta, and they claim that he took the Advaitic realization to be the highest and higher than any kind of bhakta's realization of the personal God. I think that's a mistake. I think that's exegetically wrong, but my position is as controversial as any other, and I think it's up to each person to kind of decide for themselves what Ramakrishna actually taught. I hope that answers the question.
That's clear. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, good. Now, Sutapa Sadhu, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. It was great. Actually, I grew up reading Ramakrishna's book, and there I read that Ramakrishna would offer food to goddess Kali, and he would feel the pain if she's not eating. That reciprocation, like as you said, that he wasn't actually Advaitantic, because if there is impersonal form of God, then there is I don't think that this kind of reciprocation is there between the God and the bhakta, that okay, I'm offering you something and then you please to eat. So what you said, the last point to Alan Hubbard, so that yes, it's actually probably he was a bhakta, it's not Advaitic. So can you confirm on this that okay, that reciprocation is there? I have another question. Can you elaborate on this, that reciprocation between the God and the bhakta?
Right. Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to exegesis, things are more complicated than that. I mean, I think that is one good piece of evidence in favor of the view that Ramakrishna was ultimately a bhakta, or that he was broad enough to accept the equal value and reality of the Advaitic Brahman and the personal God. But it's more complicated, and it'll take a long time to discuss these issues. But for instance, on the other side, the Advaitic interpreters of Ramakrishna will point to his training, his Advaitic sadhana under Totapuri, when in the course of his training, Ramakrishna, he was exceedingly pure in heart. And so he could very easily bring his mind up to between the eyebrows and have this ecstatic vision of Kali, who was his Ishtadevata, as you pointed out. But he kept telling Totapuri, he says, I can't get past Kali. And then what Totapuri did was he took a shard of glass and just kind of tapped tapped him between the eyebrows. And then he had a vision at that moment that the sword of knowledge, Jnana Khadga, or Jnanasi, that with the sword of knowledge, Kali was sliced in half. And then his mind soared into the realm of the impersonal absolute. And so Advaita Vedanta will pounce on passages like this and say, see, this proves that in spite of all of Ramakrishna's bhakti practices, they're clearly inferior or lower than the Advaitic realization, precisely because he had to sublate or negate the personal God in order to achieve that higher state of Advaita. So I don't want to be dogmatic about this, but I wrote an entire book defending my view. So we'd have to really go, discuss the book and then look at the evidence on both sides pretty comprehensively, because it is a complicated issue. Thanks.
Yes, I heard you actually in few of the videos, and I could definitely make out that you have a little bit different perception than some of the Ramakrishna mission followers. And another thing I wanted to ask is that, like, Ramakrishna mission does follow Bhagavad Gita. So in Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna says that I'm the Supreme Lord, and the other gods and goddesses are inferior, like his Shakti. So as you said, that initially Ramakrishna was a Vaiṣṇava. He grew up as a Vaiṣṇava, and later, because he became priest in the Kali temple, Kali Mandir, then probably he made goddess Kali as his Ishta. So because he understood that who is the supreme, so did he perceive Lord Krishna in Kali? So because again, Kali is considered to be Maya in many of the in our Vaishnavism also. Like she is the Maya Shakti who is controlling this material world. So is it that do you consider that Kali is Maya or inferior to Krishna because you follow Bhagavad Gita?
Yeah, no, again, I think, that's one interpretation of the Bhagavad Gita, but there are millions of interpretations, and there are other ways of interpreting those same shlokas. So I would not accept that interpretation of Krishna's teaching. And I think there's another way to interpret the Gita, really more along the lines of Ramakrishna, where you find in chapter 2, Krishna talking again and again about the impersonal Atman, and sometimes identifying Aham Atma Gudakesha Sarvabhutasya Sthitaha. And at the same time saying that Krishna is the avatara and that Krishna is the personal God, Ishvara Sarvabhutanam Riddeshe Tishtati Brahman. So there's another way, I think a Ramakrishnan way of reading the Bhagavad Gita. If I live long enough, I would like to write a Prasthanatraya Bhashya on from the standpoint of the Ramakrishna Vivekananda tradition. So writing a book on Bhagavad Gita and a separate book on the Upanishads and a separate book on Brahma Sutra. So I'd explore that. Thanks.
To this, I would.
I think we should probably go on because there are a few other people with questions. I think everybody should get a chance. Yeah, but thank you.
Perhaps you can email him your question.
Yeah.
So Frederick, your hand was up. You don't want to ask anymore?
It's okay. I was just wanted to say that.
Sorry, I was speaking to Frederick because he's next. I'm sorry. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, right.
Yes, thank you. I know we're getting kind of late on this paper, and I just wanted to ask one question, which is kind of along the lines of what other people have been asking. Swami Medhananda, first of all, I should say that I'm happy to meet you, that Jeff Long has sung your Jay very loudly and jubilantly to me. So I'm happy to see you. But I wonder whether the Vedanta Society has really settled on the figure of Ramakrishna, or is he still being debated within the society itself? I mean, he seems like a guy who could get into some ecstatic state, regardless of what the medium was in front of him, the spiritual or religious medium in front of him. But I mean, is it really necessary to I mean, are you continuing this debate within the society itself? That's the short question.
Yeah, I'd say I would. I mean, I wish that there was more debate. I mean, I think I don't see debates. What I see is a lot of, uncritical assumptions about what Sri Ramakrishna taught or didn't teach, and a lot of indifference, unfortunately. I wish there was more active and healthy debate about what the heck did Ramakrishna actually teach, and how did Vivekananda interpret Ramakrishna? How did other followers of Ramakrishna interpret him? What hermeneutic principles should we employ in trying to determine what Ramakrishna actually taught? I think I've more or less inaugurated it. I'm not bragging. I've been looking for a long time, but there are not active debates about this stuff. I think maybe I've started inaugurating debates because I'm making some people angry, which is, I think, a good thing.
Yes. So the debate within the Vedanta Society continues then.
Yeah, but again, I mean, debate implies that there are people who have like staked out coherent positions on the basis of research and thinking, and I don't think most of the people involved have done that. I think they just they have certain views which they hold more or less uncritically. Some people more critically, and others less. And then they just get angry if you disagree with them. That's not a debate, I think, exactly, but yeah.
Right.